In the spring of 1987, a divorce attorney named Michael Brennan sat in his office on K Street in Washington, D.C., reviewing documents for what appeared to be a straightforward dissolution of marriage case. The client, Thomas Harper, was a mid-level analyst at the Department of Energy who had been married for 11 years to a woman named Elena Harper, née Elena Volkov, a naturalized American citizen originally from East Germany. The marriage had deteriorated over the past 18 months. No dramatic incident, no discovered infidelity, simply the slow erosion of compatibility that characterizes thousands of American divorces each year. Thomas Harper wanted a fair division of assets, reasonable custody arrangements for their 8-year-old daughter, and the ability to move forward with his life. Michael Brennan had handled 300 similar cases over his 15-year career. He anticipated no complications. The documents spread across Brennan's desk told the ordinary story of an ordinary middle-class marriage coming to an ordinary end. Joint tax returns showing combined annual income of $68,000. Mortgage statements for a 3-bedroom colonial in Arlington. Photographs submitted as evidence of marital life. Birthday parties. Family vacations to Virginia Beach. Christmas mornings with wrapped presents beneath a decorated tree. Elena Harper worked as a translator for a private language services company, converting technical documents from German and Russian into English for corporate clients. Her income varied between $22,000 and $28,000 annually, depending on workload. She had no criminal record, no history of mental illness, no red flags in her background that might complicate custody proceedings. Thomas Harper described his wife as quiet, intensely private, and increasingly distant over the past year. He attributed the marriage's failure to incompatibility and diverging life goals. The case file contained nothing that distinguished it from the dozens of other dissolution proceedings that crossed Brennan's desk each month. But there was something. A detail so minor that Brennan almost dismissed it, but which lodged in his mind with the persistence of a splinter beneath skin. Among the financial documents submitted by Thomas Harper was a bank statement showing monthly deposits from Elena as employer, Meridian Language Services, along with occasional deposits for what appeared to be freelance translation work. The amounts were consistent with her reported income. But twice in the past 6 months, there had been cash deposits of exactly $3,000 each, made on the 15th of the month, with no source notation beyond the generic descriptor, cash deposit. When Brennan had asked Thomas Harper about these deposits, during their initial consultation, Harper had shrugged and offered a plausible explanation. Elena occasionally did translation work for clients who preferred to pay in cash, probably for tax reasons. It was irregular, but not unheard of. Brennan had noted it in his file and moved on. Except that he could not quite move on. Something about the precision bothered him. Not $3,200 or $2,850, exactly $3,000, twice on the same calendar date, 2 months apart. Cash payments for freelance work tend to vary. Clients pay different amounts for different projects. But these payments had the quality of something systematic, something structured, something that resembled compensation rather than payment for services rendered. It was probably nothing. It was almost certainly nothing. But Michael Brennan had practiced law long enough to recognize when a detail refused to settle comfortably into the pattern of normalcy. He decided to ask Elena Harper about it directly. A deposition was scheduled for March 12, 1987, in a conference room on the 4th floor of Brennan's building. Elena Harper arrived 15 minutes early, accompanied by her own attorney, a woman named Dorothy Chun, who specialized in family law. Elena was 38 years old, slender, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a navy blue dress and minimal jewelry. Her English was excellent, with only the faintest trace of a German accent that emerged on certain consonants. She answered Brennan's questions with careful precision, never volunteering information beyond what was directly asked, maintaining the kind of controlled composure that people develop when they have learned to guard their words. She confirmed the basic facts of the marriage. They had met in 1976 when Thomas Harper was stationed in West Berlin as a junior army officer. Elena had been working as a translator for a civilian contractor. They had married in 1978, moved to the United States shortly thereafter, and Elena had obtained citizenship in 1981. She acknowledged that the marriage had become strained, but attributed this to natural drift rather than any specific incident. When Brennan asked about the $3,000 cash deposits, Elena's composure did not waver. She explained that she occasionally performed specialized technical translation for clients in the scientific and engineering sectors who preferred confidential arrangements. The cash payments reflected this preference for privacy. The amounts were consistent because she charged a standard rate for such projects. It was all entirely legitimate. Brennan asked for the names of these clients. Elena hesitated less than a second, barely perceptible, but the hesitation existed. She stated that the clients had requested confidentiality and that she was bound by non-disclosure agreements. Brennan pressed gently. Even in divorce proceedings, where full financial disclosure was legally required? Elena's attorney interjected, noting that her client had fully disclosed the income on tax returns and that the source of legal income was not relevant to asset division. Brennan withdrew the question. The deposition continued. An hour later, it concluded with all parties agreeing to reconvene after additional financial documentation had been gathered. But the hesitation remained in Brennan's mind. Less than a second. A fractional pause before answering a straightforward question about the source of income. It was the kind of micro-expression that prosecutors learn to notice during cross-examination, the tiny fissure in composure that suggests a witness is calculating rather than remembering. Brennan sat in his office after the deposition, reviewing his notes, and found himself unable to dismiss the nagging sense that Elena Harper's explanation, while plausible, was also carefully constructed. Who were these clients who paid exactly $3,000 in cash every 2 months? What kind of technical translation required such elaborate confidentiality? And why had Elena hesitated, even for a fraction of a second, before providing her answer? Michael Brennan was not a suspicious man by nature. He did not see conspiracies in coincidences. But he had spent 15 years evaluating testimony and distinguishing truth from deception, and his instincts insisted that something in Elena Harper's explanation did not align with the mundane reality of freelance translation work. He decided to investigate, not dramatically, not with any sense that he was uncovering espionage simply to satisfy his professional obligation to ensure that his client's financial interests were protected and that all marital assets were properly accounted for. He began with the company Elena claimed to work for, Meridian Language Services. Brennan's paralegal made a series of phone calls. Meridian Language Services was a small firm registered in Virginia, operating out of a commercial office building in Crystal City. It employed approximately 15 translators working in various language pairs: German English, Russian English, Spanish English, French English, and several others. The company handled translation work for government contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and engineering firms. Elena Harper was listed as an independent contractor who worked on an as-needed basis. The company's owner, a man named Gerald Winters, confirmed that Elena had been affiliated with Meridian since 1982 and had performed competent work on dozens of projects. There was nothing irregular about the arrangement. Meridian paid Elena for completed projects via direct deposit, as documented in the bank statements. The amounts matched what would be expected for someone working part-time in technical translation. But Gerald Winters had no knowledge of Elena performing private freelance work outside of Meridian's contracts. When Brennan carefully inquired about whether translators in his company often took private clients who paid in cash, Winters responded that it was uncommon but not prohibited. Translators were independent contractors, free to accept additional work. However, Most clients seeking technical translation came through established firms rather than approaching individual translators directly. Finding clients who needed specialized scientific translation and who were willing to pay $3,000 per project in cash seemed, Winters observed, unlikely. Brennan thanked him and ended the call. Then he sat at his desk, considering the information. Elena Harper was receiving regular cash payments for translation work that her primary employer knew nothing about. The clients were anonymous. The payments were precisely scheduled. And Elena had been unwilling to identify these clients even when legal proceedings demanded financial transparency. It was still probably nothing, except that Michael Brennan no longer believed it was nothing. He picked up his phone and called an old friend from law school who now worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in the National Security Division. The friend's name was David Keller, and when Michael Brennan explained the situation over lunch at a restaurant near the Department of Justice, Keller listened with the kind of focused attention that prosecutors reserve for details that trigger deeper concern. After Brennan finished describing the cash deposits, the anonymous clients, and Elena Harper's hesitation during the deposition, Keller set down his fork and asked a single question. What does the husband do at the Department of Energy? Thomas Harper was an analyst in the Office of Defense Programs, a division responsible for managing the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile and related research. His work involved reviewing technical reports, preparing briefings for senior officials, and coordinating information between national laboratories and department leadership. He held a Q clearance, the Department of Energy's equivalent of a top-secret security clearance, which granted him access to classified information related to nuclear weapons design, materials production, and strategic planning. It was not the kind of position that involved daily access to the most sensitive secrets in the American nuclear arsenal, but it was also not a position held by someone without significant access to classified information. David Keller's expression shifted into something harder and more calculating. He asked Brennan to provide him with every detail about Elena Harper, her background, her employment history, her naturalization process, her travel patterns, her associations. Brennan, beginning to understand the implications of what he had stumbled into, agreed to cooperate fully. Keller made it clear that this conversation was now subject to security classification, and that Brennan was to discuss it with no one, including his client, until authorized to do so by the FBI. 3 days later, 2 FBI special agents arrived at Michael Brennan's office. They identified themselves as members of the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division. They explained that Elena Harper had appeared on the periphery of an ongoing investigation, but had not previously been prioritized as a primary subject of interest. The information Brennan had provided, particularly the structured cash payments and the connection to a spouse with a security clearance, had elevated her status significantly. The FBI requested Brennan's cooperation in what they termed a defensive briefing and preliminary inquiry. Brennan, now fully aware that he had opened a door he could not close, provided them with copies of all documents from the Harper divorce file. Over the following weeks, the FBI conducted a background investigation into Elena Volkov Harper that went far deeper than the standard naturalization checks she had passed in 1981. What they discovered was a woman whose biography, while technically accurate, was also carefully constructed to withstand superficial scrutiny while concealing significant gaps. Elena had been born in East Berlin in 1949. Her father had been a mid-level bureaucrat in the East German Ministry of Trade. She had attended Humboldt University, studying linguistics and Slavic languages. In 1974, at the age of 25, she had secured a position as a translator for a civilian contractor operating in West Berlin, working with Western companies doing business in Eastern Europe. This required her to obtain permission to cross into West Berlin for work purposes, an unusual arrangement during the Cold War, when East German citizens were generally prohibited from such access, but not unprecedented for individuals whose work served the state's economic interests. The permissions had been granted. Elena had worked in West Berlin for 2 years before meeting Thomas Harper in 1976. What triggered the FBI's deeper concern was not what appeared in Elena's documented history, but what did not appear. For a woman who had spent her formative years in East Berlin during the height of the Cold War, who had attended university during a period when the Stasi, the East German secret police, maintained surveillance over virtually every aspect of civilian life, and who had been granted the extraordinary privilege of working in West Berlin, there was remarkably little documentation of her activities before 1974. No records of Stasi questioning, no evidence of the routine surveillance reports that the Stasi compiled on ordinary citizens. No indication that she had ever been flagged as a security concern, despite working in proximity to Western military personnel. The absence of records was itself a record. It suggested that someone had scrubbed Elena's file, removing evidence of her associations and activities before she traveled west. And there was only one reason to scrub a file: to prepare someone for a mission that required a clean background. The FBI obtained authorization to conduct surveillance on Elena Harper. Over 6 weeks, agents documented her daily routine. She maintained a schedule of absolute regularity: morning school drop-off for her daughter, return home to work on translation projects, afternoon school pickup, evening meals, bedtime routines. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she attended a community book club at the Arlington Public Library. On Saturday mornings, she shopped for groceries at the Safeway on Lee Highway. On Sunday afternoons, she visited a park near her home, where her daughter played on the swings while Elena sat on a bench reading. Nothing in this routine suggested espionage activity. Nothing suggested anything beyond the mundane existence of a suburban mother navigating the dissolution of her marriage, except for the 15th of every other month. On those days, always the 15th, always on even-numbered months, Elena would deviate from her routine. She would leave her home at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, telling her daughter she had a translation client meeting. She would drive to a shopping center in Falls Church, park her car near a drugstore, and walk to a specific bench near a fountain in the center's outdoor courtyard. She would sit on the bench for approximately 10 minutes, reading a newspaper. Then she would stand, walk to a trash receptacle, approximately 30 feet from the bench, deposit the newspaper in the trash, and walk to a payphone mounted outside a hardware store. She would make a call lasting less than 1 minute. Then she would return to her car and drive home. The entire sequence took 40 minutes. FBI surveillance teams photographed every moment of this routine. They observed that 7 minutes after Elena deposited the newspaper in the trash receptacle, a man white, approximately 50 years old, wearing a business suit, would approach the receptacle, reach inside, retrieve the newspaper Elena had deposited, and walk to a car parked in the adjacent lot. The man was identified through license plate surveillance as Dmitry Polyakov, a diplomat attached to the Soviet embassy in Washington. D.C. Polyakov held the official title of cultural attaché. The FBI's counterintelligence division knew him as a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. The newspaper Elena deposited was not ordinary reading material. Analysis of photographs taken during her bench routine showed that the newspaper she carried was always a specific edition, the Washington Post Sunday edition, folded to a particular section. But when FBI agents retrieved newspapers from the trash receptacle after Polyakov had departed, they found newspapers that had been subtly altered. Microdot tiny photographic reductions of documents, no larger than a printed period, had been embedded in the newspaper's classified advertisement section. The microdots contained photographs of classified documents from the Department of Energy. Elena Harper was a Soviet intelligence officer. Her marriage to Thomas Harper had been, from the beginning, an operational assignment. For 11 years, she had maintained her cover as a translator and suburban mother, while systematically exploiting her husband's security clearance to obtain classified information about American nuclear weapons programs. The structured cash deposits were KGB payments for her services. The anonymous translation clients were fictional cover. The entire architecture of her American life, her naturalization, her employment, her daughter, her participation in book clubs, and parent-teacher conferences was a performance designed to conceal the fact that she was actively engaged in espionage against the United States. And Michael Brennan, a divorce attorney reviewing financial documents for an asset division case, had accidentally uncovered one of the most significant counterintelligence cases of the decade. The FBI now faced a complex strategic decision. Elena Harper was an active intelligence officer transmitting classified information to the KGB. Arresting her immediately would neutralize the threat, but would also alert Soviet intelligence that their operation had been compromised, potentially allowing other unidentified agents in Elena's network to escape detection. The alternative was to continue surveillance, identify her contacts, map the complete network, and wait for the optimal moment to roll up the entire operation simultaneously. But delay created risk. Every day Elena remained operational was another day she could transmit information that might endanger American security. The decision was made to accelerate the timeline by using Thomas Harper's divorce petition as operational cover. FBI counterintelligence officers approached Thomas Harper and informed him that his wife was suspected of espionage. The revelation devastated him. He had been married to Elena for 11 years. They had a daughter together. He had trusted her with the most intimate details of his life. And now federal agents were telling him that his wife was a Soviet intelligence officer who had likely married him specifically to gain access to his security clearance. Everything he believed about his marriage, the vacations, the Christmas mornings, the thousand small moments of shared domestic life had been, from Elena's perspective, operational theater. Harper agreed to cooperate with the FBI. The divorce proceedings would continue as planned, providing cover for increased FBI scrutiny of Elena's finances and activities. Harper would maintain normal interactions with Elena while covertly documenting any attempts she made to access his work materials or pump him for information about Department of Energy activities. He would report every conversation, every unusual behavior, every anomaly to his FBI handlers. And he would continue living in the same house with a woman he now knew had betrayed him at the most fundamental level imaginable. The psychological toll on Thomas Harper was immense. He sat across the breakfast table from Elena, discussing their daughter's school schedule, while knowing that the woman he had loved was an agent of a foreign intelligence service. He participated in mediation sessions for the divorce, negotiating custody arrangements with a person who had married him under false pretenses for the purpose of espionage. He tucked his daughter into bed at night and wondered how much of her mother's affection was genuine and how much was operational cover. The FBI provided him with counseling support, but there was no therapeutic framework adequate to process the discovery that one's entire marriage had been a lie constructed by a hostile intelligence service. For 3 months, the surveillance continued. Elena maintained her routine. On April 15th and June 15th, she performed her dead drop procedure, depositing newspapers containing microdots at the Falls Church Shopping Center, where Dmitry Polyakov retrieved them with practiced efficiency. FBI surveillance teams documented each exchange, photographed the microdots, and traced Polyakov's movements back to the Soviet embassy. But the FBI also observed something else. Elena was preparing to run. Subtle indicators suggested she had become aware of increased scrutiny. She varied her routes to routine locations. She checked for surveillance using classic counter-surveillance techniques, sudden U-turns, extended stops at locations with multiple exits, pattern breaks designed to expose any following vehicles. She made inquiries about passport renewal for herself and her daughter. And in mid-July, FBI analysts intercepted coded communications between the Soviet embassy and Moscow Center that referenced the extraction of a compromised asset from the Washington area. The decision was made to move immediately. On July 23, 1987, at 6:15 in the morning, FBI agents arrested Elena Harper at her home in Arlington. She was preparing breakfast for her daughter when agents knocked on the door. Thomas Harper, who had been sleeping in the guest bedroom since formally separating from Elena 2 months earlier, opened the door and stepped aside as agents entered. Elena's daughter, 8 years old, watched from the kitchen doorway as her mother was handcuffed and informed that she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. Elena said nothing. She did not resist. She did not ask questions. She simply stood with her hands cuffed behind her back, her expression neutral, while agents read her rights in a voice that echoed through the suburban home where she had maintained her cover for nearly a decade. The FBI's search of the house revealed the infrastructure of a professional intelligence operation concealed within the architecture of ordinary domestic life. In a hollowed-out section of the basement wall, agents found a shortwave radio capable of receiving encrypted transmissions from Soviet intelligence. In a locked filing cabinet disguised as a piece of furniture in Elena's home office, they discovered a Minox camera, one-time cipher pads for encoding messages, and 3 forged passports, American, Canadian, and Austrian, with Elena's photograph but different names. Beneath a panel in the garage floor, they recovered $43,000 in cash, divided into envelopes marked with dates extending into 1988, suggesting planned payments from the KGB for future services. And in a safe deposit box at a bank in Alexandria, accessed with a key found in Elena's purse, agents found microfilm copies of more than 200 classified documents from the Department of Energy spanning topics that included nuclear weapons design specifications, plutonium production procedures, and strategic defense analyses. The damage assessment conducted by the Department of Energy and FBI counterintelligence determined that Elena Harper had compromised some of the most sensitive information in the American nuclear weapons complex. Documents she had photographed and transmitted to Soviet intelligence included technical specifications for warhead designs, vulnerability assessments of American strategic systems, and internal debates about nuclear modernization programs. The information would allow Soviet weapons designers to understand American capabilities in detail and to develop countermeasures that could undermine the strategic balance that had existed since the beginning of the Cold War. Analysts estimated that the intelligence Elena had provided had advanced Soviet nuclear weapons development by several years and had potentially compromised the security of the American nuclear deterrent. Thomas Harper's security clearance was immediately suspended. Although he was determined to be an unwitting victim rather than a co-conspirator, the fact remained that he had been married to a Soviet intelligence officer who had exploited their relationship to access classified information. He would never work in a position requiring security clearance again. His career at the Department of Energy effectively ended the day his wife was arrested. He submitted his resignation 3 months later and took a position as a technical writer for a private engineering firm, work that required no government clearance and paid substantially less than his previous salary. Elena Harper was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, a capital offense under federal law. She was held without bail in a secure facility while federal prosecutors prepared their case. During interrogation, she exercised her right to silence, refusing to answer questions about her activities, her recruitment by Soviet intelligence, or the identity of other agents in her network. The only statement she provided was a written declaration acknowledging that she was an officer of the KGB's First Chief Directorate and that she had been conducting intelligence operations in the United States since 1976. She declined to provide any additional details. Her attorney appointed by the court after Dorothy Chun withdrew from representation upon learning the nature of the charges, negotiated a plea agreement. Elena would plead guilty to espionage charges in exchange for a sentence of 40 years in federal prison, Rather than facing a potential death penalty at trial, the plea was accepted. In November 1987, Elena Harper, whose real name was revealed during sentencing to be Elena Morozova, was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. She was transferred to a high-security facility where she would spend the next 4 decades isolated from the intelligence service that had trained her in the country she had betrayed. The most profound damage was inflicted not on intelligence systems or strategic calculations, but on the small constellation of people whose lives intersected with Elena's operational cover. Thomas Harper lost his career, his marriage, and his faith in his own judgment. He had been trained to identify security threats, had passed multiple background investigations, and had been deemed trustworthy enough to handle classified information about nuclear weapons. Yet he had failed to recognize that the woman he loved, the mother of his child, was systematically betraying the nation he had sworn to protect. The psychological impact was devastating. Friends later described him as a man who had become fundamentally uncertain about his ability to perceive reality accurately. If he could be so thoroughly deceived about something so central to his life, what else might he be wrong about? His daughter, whose name was withheld from public records to protect her privacy, faced a different kind of devastation. She was 8 years old when she watched her mother being arrested. She spent the following years shuttled between her father's household and various therapists who attempted to help her process the revelation that her mother was a spy. The psychological research on children of convicted spies is limited but consistent. They experience a profound identity fracture, unable to reconcile the parent they knew with the criminal the state declares that parent to be. Elena's daughter struggled with this fracture throughout her childhood and adolescence. She changed her name when she turned 18, severing the legal connection to both Elena Morozova and Thomas Harper. She declined all media requests for interviews. The last public information about her existence appeared in a court filing from 2003, when she petitioned to have her birth records sealed permanently. Michael Brennan, the divorce attorney who had noticed a suspicious detail in a financial disclosure form, received a commendation from the FBI for his role in exposing the espionage operation. But he also experienced the unsettling recognition that he had accidentally triggered events that destroyed a family. Elena Harper was a spy, yes, but she was also a mother whose daughter would grow up visiting her in prison, a woman whose life had been shaped by forces and decisions that occurred long before she ever met Thomas Harper. Brennan found himself thinking about the $3,000 cash deposits that had started the investigation, wondering what would have happened if he had simply accepted Elena's explanation and moved on with the divorce case. The marriage would have ended. Assets would have been divided. Thomas Harper's career would have continued. Elena would have kept spying, yes, but she would also have kept raising her daughter. Was the outcome exposure, arrest, 40 years in prison, a child's life shattered better than the alternative? Brennan did not know. He suspected there was no good answer. The case of Elena Morozova Harper never became widely known to the public. The FBI requested that media coverage be minimized to avoid alerting other Soviet intelligence officers that their tradecraft had been compromised. A brief article appeared in the Washington Post describing the arrest of a translator on espionage charges, but it provided few details and generated little public interest. The story disappeared within days, subsumed into the general background noise of Cold War tensions that Americans had learned to live with. Only those directly involved, the FBI agents, the prosecutors, Thomas Harper and his daughter, and Michael Brennan, understood the full scope of what had occurred. Elena Morozova served 27 years of her 40-year sentence before being released in 2014 as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated between the United States and Russia. She was deported to Russia, where she reportedly lived in modest circumstances on a state pension provided to retired intelligence officers. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoirs. She disappeared into the landscape of elderly women living in Moscow. Apartment blocks indistinguishable from thousands of others, except for the sealed file in the archives of Russia's foreign intelligence service that documented her years of service to the Soviet Union. Thomas Harper died in 2019 at the age of 68 from complications related to heart disease. His obituary made no mention of his former wife or the espionage case that had defined the second half of his life. It described him as a devoted father, an engineer, and a man who had served his country honorably. His daughter did not attend the funeral. According to acquaintances who knew Harper in his later years, he rarely spoke about Elena, but when he did, he described her not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted bewilderment. "I still don't know," he told a friend 6 months before his death, "how much of it was real." This is the question that haunts every case of deep cover espionage, the question that can never be satisfactorily answered. How much of the performed life was genuine? Did Elena Morozova feel affection for the man she married as part of an intelligence operation? Did she love her daughter, even though that daughter had been conceived as part of her operational cover? Were there moments, Christmas mornings, family vacations, quiet evenings, when the performance dissolved and genuine human connection emerged? Or was every gesture, every smile, every expression of love calculated and false? The truth is that even Elena herself might not know the answer. Human beings are not capable of maintaining complete psychological compartmentalization for 11 years. The boundaries between performance and reality become blurred. The role becomes the person. It is possible, even likely, that Elena experienced genuine love for her daughter, even while maintaining her commitment to Soviet intelligence. It is possible that she felt authentic affection for Thomas Harper, even as she betrayed him. The human capacity for simultaneous truth and deception, for genuine emotion within a structure of lies, is one of the most disturbing aspects of espionage work. We want clear moral categories: villain and victim, betrayer and betrayed. But the reality is far more complex and far more unsettling. Michael Brennan never handled another divorce case involving a spouse with a security clearance. He referred such cases to other attorneys, unwilling to risk stumbling into another counterintelligence investigation. He retired from legal practice in 2005 and now lives in Maryland, where he occasionally lectures at law schools about the unexpected intersections between family law and national security. When asked about the Elena Harper case, he describes it not as a triumph of careful observation, but as a cautionary tale about the hidden complications that exist beneath the surface of ordinary life. The Cold War created thousands of Elena Morozova Harper's intelligence officers who assumed false identities, built false lives, and exploited genuine human relationships for espionage purposes. Some were caught, many were not. The ones who succeeded remained undetected for decades, living their covers so convincingly that even those closest to them never suspected the truth. They drove carpool. They attended PTA meetings. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. And beneath all of it, they photographed documents, encoded messages, and transmitted secrets to handlers who existed in a parallel world the people around them could not perceive. What Michael Brennan discovered in that divorce case in 1987 was not just evidence of espionage, but evidence of a more fundamental truth: that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary deception, that trust can be weaponized, and that the person sleeping beside you might be someone you do not know at all. This knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. It changes the way one perceives the world, introducing a permanent note of uncertainty into human relationships that should be characterized by certainty. If a divorce attorney reviewing financial disclosure forms can accidentally uncover a Soviet intelligence operation, what else might be hidden in the mundane details of daily existence? What other secrets are concealed behind the facade of normalcy that surrounds us? These are the questions that persist long after the arrests have been made and the sentences have been served. They are the Cold War's most enduring legacy, not the geopolitical confrontations or the nuclear standoffs, but the corrosive uncertainty about whether the people we trust are who they claim to be. Elena Morozova Harper married Thomas Harper, lived with him for 11 years, raised a child with him, and betrayed him every single day. And he never knew. Not until a lawyer noticed that 2 cash deposits were suspiciously regular, and asked a question that unraveled everything. In the end, espionage is not about the dramatic moments of confrontation or the high-stakes operations that dominate thriller fiction. It is about the patient accumulation of small deceptions, the careful construction of false normality, and the exploitation of the human tendency to trust what appears ordinary. It is about a woman sitting on a bench reading a newspaper while a KGB officer waits 30 feet away to retrieve the microdots hidden in the classified ads. It is about a marriage that was always, from the very beginning, a lie except for the parts that might have been real. And which parts those were, no one will ever truly know.